Greetings. Welcome to this century thinking, the eighth webinar in this series. Today we're going to be talking about viable hierarchy. And it's a wonderful thing, hierarchy. You know, we know it exists in nature. But just as humans have messed up nature, and that we control nature in many ways rather than living with nature, we also do wonderful things with hierarchy. But before we get into that, may, as ever, I pay respects to the people of the country that I stand on, the Wurundjeri country here in what we know locally as Sunbury, and this is the view out of our front door, and always was, always will be Wurundjeri country. And there's a lot to be learned from how it is that this Wurundjeri people looked after this country for 60,000 years, and how we might take lessons from that in how we not only regenerate our country, not only regenerate the nation, but also regenerate the way in which we manage, because they're, you know, outstanding managers of country, and there's a lot to be learned from them in terms of the way in which we can bring lessons into how we manage ourselves, our social systems, and our people. Now, speaking of management, I spent some time, a good many years in fact, in the defence, a few years in uniform as an army reservist, but then 20 years as a defence scientist. And that culminated with me being the scientific advisor for strategic policy and planning. Well, that sounds a fairly fancy title. And I got this gig from some work I'd done for Army. And a general, after one reorganisation, brought me into his office and he said, "Richard, I'd love you to come into this brand new strategic planning division. You know, we've just had a reorg. Great." He says, "There's 4 branches here, each headed up by a 1-star. One of them is looking at the strategic view to the future, the strategic intelligence, and really trying to get an understanding of the national interest. Another is looking at, well, what does that mean for the military objectives and why we have a military in this country. The third branch then goes, well, if that's what the military has to do, what then do we need to set as priorities for where we spend our money?" And we get a significant slice of the government budget. And then the fourth one was just capability analysis branch, which was really then doing the analysis to see whether or not that money had been spent well and would achieve the effects that it was being invested in. Well, and he said, "My real concern is that these 4 branches will go deep into their organizational stovepipes and won't talk to each other. Well, they'll start doing basically what we've always done in very rationalist organizations. But your job," he says, "is to bring a scientific discipline, a scientific approach to this." He says, "And I don't know what that means. But there you go. There's your job. Go do it." So what I'll be talking about today is a bit that comes from that. And you'll get some insight into that as to what happened. But about 2 years in, as we were starting to get results, here I was sitting between 2 generals, briefing the results of 40 40 different experiments that we'd conducted, looking at various scenarios and ways of spending the money, and learning and gleaning from what we could that was common across those 40 experiments. So I'm briefing the results. And as I'm talking to the general, the deputy is flipping furiously through the briefing paper. That was a mistake, giving him the briefing paper. So he's flipping furiously through the briefing paper. As I'm talking to the chief, I just hear him say, "Where's that force?" I can't say which one it was. But without even thinking, I didn't miss a stride. I just said, "You don't need it." And I briefly went back to briefing the chief, but I saw out of the corner of my eye this movement, and my briefing paper went head over heels, high, almost hit the ceiling, and landed boof, all the way down at the other end of the of the conference table. And I kid you, it was nearly as long as this conference table that you see here. It was a fair old throw. Boom. You don't need it. And that then, brought me back to life in many ways. And well, I could talk through and explain how we came to that decision and how we came to that what the evidence showed. But it's very clear that you can have reason within the hierarchy, but when hierarchy is power, then they're the ones that actually get the decision, right? And what is it about viable hierarchies that then enable that to occur? And maybe there will always be power, as there will be in hierarchies. But what the reason does within the viable hierarchy, the cognitive frame, is able to say, yes, minister or sir or CEO, you can make that decision. Here's the risk if you do, right? Here's the risk if you do. And don't for the life of me think that that was just because they're powerful military people that I was briefing. I had the same within the health sector. We had top 40 execs of one health community together over 2 months and a number of different workshops, and we're coming to the last workshop, and we'd already been around and briefed them, and I had 2 of the top executives on my table out of the 4 tables in the workshop. And they'd each had their briefing paper. After we'd spoken with them, we left them with the briefing paper, didn't make that mistake twice. Spoke to them first, left them with the briefing paper, and now we were coming together in this workshop. Well, as I sat down to the table, I just said, so you've had this for a week. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Whatever. And one of these CEOs within this health sector picks up the folder, strolls across to the waste paper bin that was just over there, and he goes, "It's a whole lot of shit." Boom, in it went, folder, the whole lot, bang, in there. And she strolls back to the table and sits down. Of course, no one's saying anything. She's got her place in this, and clearly, a senior person within the hierarchy. Oh, never seen that before, I must admit, I says. But tell me, help me correlate with another reaction I got. Because when me and my mate, Les, were at breakfast this morning, we just happened to walk past your colleague, Terry, who's the CEO of that area over there. And he said to us, he says, anyone in this room would tell you I'm a pretty hard marker. In fact, really hard. So it's really quite something if I was to say to you 2 fellas, You've done a damn good job here. So now, please you help me correlate these two reactions. And she said, well, and she didn't say much actually. She got up, meekly walked over, picked her folder up out of the bin and came back down again. So this whole thing of hierarchy and power is something that needs to be built into the organization in ways that enable much more collaboration and much less posturing and much less, demonstration of power to try and keep people in their places. And it's giving people the chance to speak up and say the things that others, particularly those in power, don't really want to hear, but really must be said. And these are the things that if we have a viable hierarchy, then we can see people stand up in their truth and speak with courage without roaring. And that's really where we're trying to get to. And it all comes down to really where we've been. What are the fundamental values you hold, from the family, and there's my wife, Vicky, in this picture, and my family below. And the values we conceive, how I take that into the work that I've done and the work that I do, and how each of us can do that, and how we think about counting the value so that we actually end up making genuine progress that first does no harm. And that's really where we've come from in this series, with a view then to looking at this issue of viability and how we can build living organizations. And in the next webinar, we'll get into this leadership piece at the end of the year. But really where we've, these two stories get us to is that we live in organizations that don't practice holism, that are imbued with structural divisibility, right? As opposed to where we've been talking in the viable side, well, what are the primary functions and how do they stay connected? And it's the bringing together of these two elements is really what we're about. And last time we looked at adaptive connectivity in the sense of the doing, how we govern, plan, manage, assess, and assure, and keep that connected so that there is a flow through the system, which is absolutely essential when we think about the impacts that we want to have on the one hand, the work that we've got to do to get that done, and how we then manage that to get the synchronization to create the impact. And then there's that, of course, the policy piece that is the regulation and the regulatory arm of leaders and managers. Cheers. So that indeed, with the adaptive connectivity, managers can then ask, how are you going to meet these goals? How are we going to spend, like in the defense example, how are we going to spend and prioritize the allocation of $60 billion to do what needs to be done out here? And then the production team can go, well, here's how we think we do it. And then the leaders seek to assure that that becomes the game. And this whole thing happens by not breaking into functional groups, but keeping the functions working well together. And that was, something that we covered last week. But it's really important as it goes to the issue of how we create hierarchy, because of the fractal nature of the way in which this flows, from the individual working in a group, from the group being part of a broader business, and from the business being part of a larger industry. And those are the things, and there's a natural hierarchy that is created just in the nature of how these flows occur. And the bigger the impact that we're seeking to have, likely the more layers in the fractal recursion that we're likely to find. So, and so you see that is what will happen as we layer the production with some level of systems of control and then some policy frameworks that then guide how the systems are designed, so that the focus really is on how those policy and systems amplify the production. They may constrain it, but that only when it's absolutely necessary to assure the impacts that do no harm. So the focus is always there, and I'd really love to draw this diagram up the other way, right? So the impact, just from the way in which we read it, is top of mind all the time. So good management then creates the conditions for leadership to emerge at every level. Now today we're going to dive into the structural divisibility. How do you structure around these value propositions viably and for life? I love the way that eye creeps in on you. Right, we're watching. Now, who hasn't watched Simon Sinek's talk from about 2009 or 2010, where he's presenting the golden circles? And in the golden circle, his message is very clear. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Super. And in this frame, he says very few people know why you do it. Only a few more know how it's done, and a lot get engaged in the widgets and the what and all of the thing, and too much energy goes out into the what. I have a little bit of a problem with Simon's proposition, and I'll go into that a little. See, Simon is a marketing guy. That's where he's come from, and from marketing stepped into being a leadership advisor. Super. And when you're communicating, then those two elements around the why and the how are the two elements that strike the emotional parts of the brain in the limbic system. That's why this golden circle works when you're communicating. But when you're designing, the what's coming to focus. And let's have a look at why that might be. There's a relationship among the why, the what, and the how. And I deliberately put them in that order. Because as you go through understanding why an organization exists, what it seeks to do, and how it does it, when you design your structure, which is part of the how, you should be testing and evaluating as to whether or not it's actually achieving what the organization was set up to do. Is there a value that does no harm in the contribution being made? Questions often not asked. And the relationship between the parts is that from the understanding of why an organization exists, you can analyze what it needs to do to make that true. And then you can design your physical instantiation of the organization in order to meet those requirements. Right? And that really then impacts, you get the needs, the functions, and the form. And function always precedes form, you know? Systems engineers will tell you, and so might a few others. So let's restack that. And let's pick on the neuroscience of this again. Go back and relate it back to what Simon is saying as to why he puts why, how, what. Because these are part and parcel of the limbic system. But in order for something to go from the very core, the reptile brain, the reptilian brain, through into the longer term memory, if you like, the experiential element, come on, we go through an understanding of the what, and that is the frontal cortex, right? That is the front of the brain that goes, yeah, that'll work, no, that won't, or we'll give it a go, and yeah, no, actually I've done that 3 times now and it works, boom, and then it just becomes part of the way in which you do it, right? But there's this constant bouncing in and out of the frontal cortex, which is what separates the humans from every other species, is our capacity for this form of analysis, design, test, and evaluation. Whether or not we think of it in these terms, this is literally the way in which we engage with the world. Children do. They just don't know. And you can take that construct and lay it out across the business. You can go, you know what? Why does the strategic element exist? What does it do? How does it do it? And then the breakdown each major element of the organization to come down to the lines of business and then down to the actual unit level. And what you see within this frame is indeed a separation. And we'll come to that in a minute. But the main point is, and that natural framing of why it slides down like that actually comes from some work done by Professor Rasmussen and cognitive work analysis. But there's no one why as for any particular organization. There's several of them. And the reasons that someone at a unit gets out of bed in order to go and do their job might be because they really love driving trucks and they don't mind too much what they deliver as long as they can drive big trucks. And if that's the transport unit that they work in, they might not care whether or not it's about feeding the people or shifting oil or what have you. That then is what needs to be understood if we are to get improvements in staff engagement, which really, as Gallup consistently tells us, is at an all-time low. So how we think about the why, what, how at each level of the hierarchy and design them accordingly gives us the opportunity to have a much more adaptive and yet connected and ecologically separated groupings within the organization. And what you find is that the strategic performance of the organization depends on the organizational effectiveness and the success at the line of the business. So it should tell everyone that's sitting right up there at the top, right up here, that actually their focus needs to be on creating success here. Not asking them why they're not creating success here. The look must always be down into the line of business and create the conditions by which you can amplify or attenuate the noise around success for that line of business. So in many ways, if you had 4 models around why, what, how, and if, you could actually create a model framework for any organization. You can employ and really connect between those models, to the emotional parts, because we know in making a decision that the emotional centers of the brain fires 13 seconds ahead of the rational elements of the brain. And yet we want everything to be rational. We're making this decision because it shifts us from here to there. That's part of the contrast frame in an if model. And what is it that we've done for the world, and you know, what is our profit, what is our top line success, what is our bottom line success, etc. Those are the sorts of things that we tend to focus on instead of actually the other elements of it. Now, I'm going to go through this again, but now get into and say, you know what, there's quite a bit of systems engineering behind this, and I know a few systems engineers on the call have probably recognized that already. What we've got here is the old egg diagram, right? And with the egg diagram, it was, as you see, simply really understanding that before you can transform inputs to outputs, you need to understand the needs, go through a requirements analysis in order to determine the abilities that are needed, fitness for purpose, and then design the physical system based on that functional analysis. And then before you actually make a decision, test and evaluate whether the form will meet the requirements and the needs. And it's all a trade-off. There's rarely a perfect answer. Make a decision and out you go, and you keep that going. That's the whole idea. And you can do that, and this is what came from my work when I was as the scientific advisor of strategic policy and planning, to say, but you know what, there's no one way of doing strategic planning. There's plenty of ideas as to why we need a defense force, and plenty of technology that's shifting at a huge rate as to how we can deliver it. So what if we took a few scenarios that might be why we need a defense force in the future, and you can, and this also was part of the approach I took with health, so it works right across the spectrum. Why, you know, the scenarios for why an organization might exist, and some options as to how you might build your company in the future, and then crash them together in a seminar gaming experiment where you test and evaluate that thinking. And so strategic planning becomes much more of a game, a very serious game. You can play lightly, because any one test is just a lot of nice to know. But if you've done that and had that conversation where you've played one of those games every week for 40 weeks, and then you spend the last 10 weeks of the year doing some analysis to say, well, what abilities did we consistently use and which did we not use? What are the risks of just investing in those? What's the performance and trade-off? If you know, the worst case arose and we invested in this, would it still work? And so you could go around it again, but ultimately then in that process, come up with a much more robust set of evidence as to why that particular strategy and investment profile and priorities work for you. Then, part and parcel of how you do that helps you shape your fundamental hierarchy. You know why an organization exists, what are the major chunks of the organization you need, and in each of the major chunks, what, so that's your functional bit, how do you then design your unit level and its operations in order to meet those requirements of the organization. So you can then structure an organization as such, right? And again, this has a lot of support in the cognitive work analysis science, and particularly the work of Rasmussen, as I've mentioned before. Now, Gary Hamel wrote a book in 2000 that was about the revolution. You know, we were all into revolutions at the turn of the century. We'd had a revolution in military affairs, revolution in business affairs, and Gary was part and parcel of that. He's a professor out of California. And he's also at the London Business School of Management. So here's something that he said. You know, there is an interview with the CEO. The CEO would say, spend a lot of time worrying about the how. And how many CEOs still spend a lot of time worrying about the how? Now I spend my time worrying about the what. Right? What opportunities, what partnerships, what technologies, what experiments to start. And here's the reason. As Gary goes on. Yes, fiddle around, you know, getting as efficient as you can and get the last 5% efficiency out of the how. Someone's invented a new what. Inventing new whats, that's the thing, right? And Gary went on to say also that these industrial revolutionaries are like a missile up the tailpipe. Boom! You're irrelevant. You know? Focus on the whats. So there you go, Simon. By all means, then when you know what you're going to actually invest in, you can tell people why, and they will buy into it. They will buy the why if you've done the work on the whats. And the whys then, as they go down through, help drive and frame your measures for success. The whats help frame your measures of effectiveness. And the hows, which hopefully you've left to each of the parts of the organization to design themselves, because that's how they stay adaptive, then become the measures of performance, so that you've got the top-down relevance and bottom-up accuracy. And that's the seeding that you want to achieve in your measurement frames through an organization. And how you design your organization and how you think about it through an engineered process, then lo and behold, you'll find fewer measures and the ones that really matter. Because you want coherence and consistency. And the performance of the policy initiatives are dependent on the effectiveness of the strategies and the success of the execution. So the focus again is all the way bringing the hierarchy down and to focusing on the success of the execution. And if you remember from last week, you know, we connected who we are to what we do. And the connection between those two gives us our purpose, our why. Who we are, the values we bring, and what we do. There's your why. And it fits in this frame too. So, I'm not quite sure. I've got two of those. Here's where we wanted to go. I want to tease this out because there's not a direct correlation between a how and a what, or a what and a why. What you've got is a frame, and because each of these are viable systems in their own right. Each of them govern, plan, manage, assess, assure, and produce what they're set up to produce. All right? And as you've got that, then what you've got in between them is an ecological interface. And what I mean by that is that they mutually constrain one another. Because of the choices made about the environments we're going to play in, or the markets we're going to play in, and the capabilities we're going to invest in, shape what we're actually able to do. And shortage of staff, shortage of trained people constrains the choices that we're able to put into the strategy work and should frame the policy work. So therefore, this whole need for connectivity and for that to be adaptive. Well, lo and behold, as you see each of these columns is essentially a systems engineering model, the egg model in another way. The key to keeping them connected lies in how you do your test and evaluation. So is there a central group that keeps an eye on this? Not as constables, but they're assuring contestability. They're assuring coherence and consistency. Actually, the contestability comes up the top. And in the same line about thinking about the ways in which analysis and control. Do your information systems actually frame that? Do your methods take a soft systems approach that makes sure the right people get invited into the conversation, get the problems defined in ways that are meaningful within the designed constraints, and how those functions across the hierarchies are maintained really then help provide the main arterial connections between those elements in the functional hierarchy. When you do that, then what you've got is a viable hierarchy because you can get flow all the way through. And you can do what Stafford Beer would say is have an algedonic system. So that's basically an alert system. You know, you touch something, it's hot, shit, well, you pull your finger out the way quick, right? Or a, what happened? Oh, a satellite dish, an aerial collapsed overnight. And the engineers had warned that this was happening. And indeed, you know, we were able to see the video of it this morning of how, so that was an algedonic system at work, where indeed they had the right sensors in place, the right sense making to be made of the data they had available for that then to be allowed to happen. Now, that might not have been the best example, but we'll run with it for now. And here's one, I don't expect you to read this, and I'm not going to endeavor to do it, but here's one that I created for the Royal Australian Navy. The structural foundations that really go right up at the highest strategic tier. Why do you have a defence force? What does the defence force do? How does the defence force do it? All right. And part and parcel of that, what is the maritime component that we need to be able to create some effects in the maritime environment? Right. So that means we need a fleet. Why do we have a fleet? Ties to what are the strategic outcomes. What does a fleet do? Well, there's some bits in there, and that's all in the public information. That's straight out of the portfolio budget statement. So no secrets there. There's no secrets on any of this. Then how does the fleet choose to do that? Well, it actually has a fleet planning schedule. Perhaps no surprise, right? Like any good asset-based organization, you know, how you use your assets is primary consideration. So that's then the frames that they put in place. And for any of the force groups, why does that exist? Well, that's because the fleet is seeking to create effects above the water, below the water, in the air, through intelligence and the like. And that helps determine what are the force groups that they need. So their what then becomes the why does this force group exist? And then, lo and behold, you go, well, what does that force group do? And how does it do it? Well, what the force group does actually must tie into what the fleet requires of it, and how is the fleet going to operate, and what the force group do. There's the relationship between the two. And then how does the force group do that? Well, now the force group goes, yeah, well, you know what? We don't have all of that capability in. We also have a fair amount of it out there in industry. So therefore, we've got to be really clear in how we organize our personnel and our training and our collective engagement, our supplies, our support, our facilities. These are the things that at the force group level, they then seek to make sure it all comes together and put their own processes in place that brings those elements together, and the force group manages those interfaces and the cost. And lo and behold, that then frees up the ship to say, it's over the next 2-year period, this is your job. And it'll have, you know, active schedule, maintenance schedules, so on. The captain of the ship may have 200-300 people on board, all wrapped up at the unit level. They know why they exist, because they're aligned in not only the force group's requirements, but also in fleet requirements. So the captain of the ship, you know, he tells me, you see that line there? That's my job for 2 years. That, as long as that, whatever's on that line, that's my job. So that's why that ship exists. What does the ship do? Well, then there's workups, there's maintenance periods, and so on and so forth that fit the schedule, and that's all teased out, again tying in with industry for that ship to get the priorities. And then you integrate the fundamental inputs, because you've got a lot of people coming together, and how that then delivers the capability ties back ultimately to the Chief of Navy's contract, if you like, with government. So then in that sort of frame, you can see how that what conceptual framework becomes real. Now, where are we time-wise? And I'll just actually wrap up now. So actually that can be quite dynamic, particularly when the design processes are left in the hands of those that do the work. Because then you've got them engaged. They've got some power over their own destiny that fits within the destiny of something larger than them. And when that happens, people stay engaged. And we know this. And that's how you can build it into the structure, right? So it need not be the stuff of science fiction. And in my last webinar for this year, which will occur on the 18th of December, I'm going to now bring these 6 models together. And if any of you have been watching on LinkedIn, you might well have seen this little cube. They'll all appear on here in some way, shape or form, and I'll reveal that in the next webinar, because it's all geared around something we learned in 1970 when Conant Ashby, 2 professors, wrote a paper with this title. And it's about every good regulator of a system is a model of that system. Well, from here, the way in which we design hierarchies, there's an example of how every leader is a regulator of an organizational system. Every regulator of a system is a model of that system. So therefore, every leader of a complex adaptive system has to be, must be, not is. Actually, I wrote that wrong. The word is must, not is. Every leader of a complex adaptive system must be a model of that system. So therefore, the work that we've been doing through these webinars will come together in the next time as to show how it all then unfolds to enable leaders to put their organizations in the box and use those models as windows that allow light to shine on their enterprise to see just how adaptive it might be. And wouldn't that be a good thing? So I stand for continuous learning, next generation of leadership and governance. That's all good stuff. But particularly, I love the whole frame of trying to not unify, but connect, maybe should be the word, the political, social, and technology aims. So that, just as I started with that story, we could say, yes, Minister, you can always choose to do that. That's your decision, right? Here's the risk. If you want that risk, please sign this paper saying you've accepted that risk. And get it on the public record. I'll continue with my research and writing, and that book, by God, even if I've got to give blood to give it, will come out next year. I'll be looking at developing, and reframing any masterclasses around these 6 models so that people get the embeddedness to understand the 6 models before they then are able to use it and bring systems thinking into their leadership. And I've got a couple of spots available should anyone wish mentoring. There's a global bestseller. My goodness. And I wrote chapter 1 within that, which really looks at the ecological viewpoint. So if we haven't connected, I'm pretty sure we have on many levels. Let's do that. But now perhaps let's stop the share and open the conversation to those who'd like to open their mics and tell me what you're thinking, feeling, and or knowing based on your experience that helps move this conversation along.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's Craig here.
Hey, Craig, how are you?
Good. Just want to start by saying thanks for the talk. It's been a while since we've spoken. It was good stuff. I appreciated. Thing that I particularly kind of hung on in that talk was that the bit where you were kind of riposting against Sinek, right? Like, that aim for the middle kind of layer, right? Like, me running a business, I have this strategic intent and this purpose in the organization, but I know most of the younger people, frontline people in the organization don't care about that. Their horizons are much more closer to their, to their own kind of locus.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about that a bit.
And if their hierarchy is structured in a viable way, and that they're given the freedom to design their own ways of achieving what's been set for them, great. Then the conversation can always be, well, do you not only know what I've asked you to do, but why I do that, and why that's important higher up. And the executive conversation that goes from that don't just keep it, very much task oriented, but let them see the consequence of their work and why they've been employed to do that. I think is, it's almost negligent of an executive if they're not making sure their employees understand where they fit in the consequences of the work that's done.
Yeah. So in our context, it's like a software service business, right? And so we've got all these different customers. And so I would frame the primary measure of performance, the feedback we get from our customers, right? Yeah. Did they achieve their business outcomes? Did they appreciate working with us? Have they got anything positive or useful to say back to us about the way their experience? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But one of the things there is like, one of the challenges we face, I'll shut up in a minute, but one of the challenges we face.
All right, I noticed Kevin's got his hand up, so we'll come to Kevin next.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of 27-year-olds don't necessarily want to own that responsibility, right? They might want to, but they don't have confidence or feel brave enough to take it on.
Well, again, but you see that, and that might be so, and fair enough. You know, how much were we prepared to take on? Yeah, okay. Not everyone's a Napoleon who's going to be a 20-something-year-old general. But let's think of ourselves more and as cathedral builders, that maybe we don't have a plan, and be as open as that we can't guarantee this future unless we get everyone engaged in creating that future, and how we get the co-creation. Then the apprentice stonemason ultimately can become the cathedral builder, knowing that the cathedral's still going to be going and maybe not finished construction for 200 years. That's, but yet still be used in the time. All right, thanks, Craig. Kevin, then Alan.
Richard, a spectacular presentation. Just want to thank you very much for that. A couple things leapt out at me. I had not seen the Rasmussen work before, and I really like that staggered sliding fractal of the why, what, and how. It's an amplification of something I'd noticed before, but this helps put a much sharper point to it, that the strategic of one level becomes the tactical of another. And I think that's an excellent amplification.
And what's strategic for you might not be strategic for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I appreciate that model. It helps me wrap my mind around something that I've more intuitively than analytically been able to grab before. Yeah. The other thing that I really appreciated about what you're showing today was my background originally was in software. You want to show me something?
I do really. So I found now, this is by Kim Vicente, Vicente, Cognitive Work Analysis. Now, he was a student of Rasmussen, and I found this much more approachable. Rasmussen is a Dane, and not that colors him, but his work is a little more stoic, might I say, than and I find Kim Vicente's work a little more accessible. But he was a student of Rasmussen.
I'll pop that link in the recording.
Thank you, lovely.
Excellent, thank you. The other thing that leapt out to me, my background is in software. Before I got into systems as they're known and loved in general, I was doing software work for quite a long time, and I never realized that was prepping me for system. Software is a beautiful abstraction of systems. And early in what I was doing, I realized that we needed to take a both and to the historic conflict of whether there's a top-down or bottom-up design. And especially in the embedded software world, where resources are highly constrained and pin counts are fixed and whatnot, it's essential to do a top-down to make sure the objectives are achieved, but it's equally essential to do a bottom-up to make sure one works within the realities of what the external world imposes. And I think the augmentation of the diagram that you showed is another beautiful illustration. And I'd just like to suggest that you may throw the software corollary in there in the future, because I think there's a beautiful lesson to be learned from that.
Well, thank you, Kevin. After the defense gig, I went and as a strategy consultant with Booz Allen for a little while, and then as the general manager of CAE, professional services here in Australia, back in 2007. And I'd inherited a software development unit within that. And I'm a strategy guy, and you ask these guys what they're doing, they're straight into the noughts and ones. Whoa. So I ran them through this as a little tutorial and said, look, we need to be able to connect what you're doing right now in basically creating a software, by software, a copy of what was to be the airborne early warning and control aircraft, and a million lines of code here and something up here. I understand why we're buying money here. So you've got to be able to connect code your cutting here with something that helps improve this beast here. And you do that and explain for me and anyone that comes into this office from there to there and why then you're working on that today. Then people will go, good job, I get it. And that was really quite instrumental. And when I found that in talking with my software guys, after about 6 months, they would start here and step me down and then step me down and go, and what that means in software is, boom. Yeah, super. Thank you, Kevin. Alan.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to say a couple of things. The first one is a huge thank you to showing that example of the structure of hierarchy from the Navy. Such a brilliant example in an amazingly complex system broken down and showing that interconnectedness. I've done so many maps similar to that, and I've never seen one as detailed. So a huge thank you to show of
You're welcome.
how we can pull these things together in such detail.
Well, you can then take it further, Alan, because once you've got it down there like that, then you say, well, okay, what's the performance? Put the metric system right across the bottom, and it's got to tie in, as we talked about before, so that when something goes red down at the ship level, part of that algedonic system, the alert system, that it's seen where it needs to be seen and doesn't somehow go from red to green because they don't want bad news going up.
Yes, yeah, and that is also a little bit tied into my next point that I wanted to make, and which actually linked back into what Craig said earlier around the experience of 27-year-olds and not knowing how they fit in the organization. And I've done work in similar capacity to what Craig was talking about with our largest telco here in Australia, not to name names, and having armies of call center operators that are not knowing their place, not understanding how they fit, and are constrained by the system within which they are trying to perform, but not necessarily understanding their component or their part of that machine. And I've personally in Craig had success in finding ways to connect executives to the meaning of these individuals and how that meaning can be brought into the system, not just so that the 27-year-olds can understand what role it is that they need to play, but conversely, how these executives can bring the learnings that the 27-year-olds have into their own system back into being able to develop and grow. Because as we talked about earlier, and as you rightly pointed out, Richard, if we are able to take what these frontline workers are doing, because they are, after all, the experts in what it is that they are doing, and bring that back into the strategic core of the organization, we'll not only be empowering those people, but we will also be moving more towards being able to accommodate needs and demands on the system from the examples that are being drawn from those frontline people at a strategic level as well.
Well, the thing is, and I think that, military organizations and health organizations and, well, airlines, there's so many organizations where indeed we need to flip our presentation of these things, and I have done that within the military environment. But what you end up doing then is going, all of these frontline folks here, and then boom, 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 and all the way down here is the admiral or the general or whoever that's running the show, but they're used to being seen up here, not down there. But their job is to make sure that one, all of these are headed in the right direction, doing the right things within the right boundaries, but ultimately the work of the organization is done up here. Not that it's not done here, but it's how that contribution moves towards where the front line and actual service area is. The other thing within that hierarchy is that it enables you to look as you step up through it, and be precise about what is the value added. And if you can't be precise about it, ask the question, why is it there then?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's brilliant insight.
So wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I see we're 2 minutes past the hour, but I did start 2 minutes late. So may I thank you all for joining. And our next one will be the grand tying together on the 18th of December, and that'll be the last for this year.